This CEO pretended to be poor to test his staff, and what he found was unbelievable. Welcome to the channel, where every story reveals a powerful truth. If you're enjoying this journey, take a moment to comment below and let us know, where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing our community grow across the globe. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss tomorrow's incredible story. It's one you won't want to miss. Your support means everything. In the bustling heart of Los Angeles, where luxury sedans lined the streets, and valet stands gleamed under the California sun, there stood a car dealership unlike any other. With towering glass windows, marble floors, and million-dollar vehicles on display, it was a symbol of class and exclusivity. But for Richard Walker, this place was more than just a business. It was his legacy. At 52, Richard was the founder and owner of one of the largest chains of luxury car dealerships in the United States. Over the years, he had built his empire on one guiding principle: every customer deserves respect. Not just the ones who walked in wearing a Rolex or tailored suits, but everyone. He had always believed that integrity starts with how you treat those you think can offer you nothing. In return, but lately, he'd had doubts. Too many times he had received stories, whispers really, about how some of his employees were choosing who to serve based on appearances. A young man in work boots being ignored, an older woman being talked down to. And, though Richard had implemented training after training, something told him the real test wasn't in a manual. It was in the moment. So, on one sunny Tuesday morning, Richard decided to see for himself. No suits, no briefcase, no assistants. Just him. He put on a plain light blue shirt, a faded pair of jeans, and some old sneakers. With a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, he looked more like a tired truck driver than the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. He parked his mid-range sedan a few blocks away to avoid being recognized, and walked toward his own dealership. As he stepped inside, the familiar smell of polished leather and fresh espresso filled the air. The lighting was soft, the atmosphere calm, designed to make every guest feel like royalty. But almost immediately, he could feel it. The way one salesperson glanced at him and then quickly looked away. The consultant at the front desk, busy. Tapping on his phone, didn't even bother to greet him. Two salesmen chatted nearby, laughing as they passed by, not even offering a nod. Richard walked slowly between rows of gleaming cars, models worth over $100,000, pausing here and there, pretending to examine details. Not a single employee approached. No one offered assistance. No one asked his name. After 10 full minutes of wandering, one salesman finally spoke up, but not to help. He smirked, tilted his head, and said, "Sir, the used cars are on the other side of the lot," before turning away. And in that moment, Richard didn't feel angry. He felt disappointed. This wasn't just a customer being mistreated. This was a failure of his culture, a betrayal of everything he had worked to build. But instead of reacting with rage, Richard simply smiled, turned around, and walked toward the exit, because the test had just begun, and what came next would change everything. As Richard stepped back from the glistening cars, he found himself near the corner of the showroom, still unnoticed, still unacknowledged. He paused, watching, the staff not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. This wasn't just about bad service, it was about attitude, about how easily people judge others based on what they see. And right now, Richard Walker wasn't the CEO. To them, he was just a man in cheap clothes, who didn't belong, but he did belong. More than anyone else in that building. He turned slightly just in time to catch a smirk on one salesman's face. The man leaned over to his colleague and whispered something, both of them chuckling as they glanced in Richard's direction. It wasn't hard to guess what they were thinking. Still, Richard kept his cool. He'd been in boardrooms with billionaires, negotiated with corporate giants, and handled scandal after scandal. But this moment, it stung more than he expected, because this wasn't just a failure of manners, it was a failure of leadership. 1. Of the consultants, A tall guy in a sharp tie and polished shoes finally walked over, not to greet but to dismiss. "Sir," he said with a practiced fake smile, "you might want to try our pre-owned lot next door. These models here," he glanced at the nearest $160,000 luxury coupe, "are a little high-end." Richard looked him in the eye. No welcome, no questions, just assumptions. He nodded slowly, said nothing, and watched the man walk off without another word. The consultant didn't even wait for a response, just turned his back. And that was the moment Richard knew. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was systemic. He glanced around again. The receptionist was twirling her hair, texting. Two other salespeople were huddled in the corner talking about sports. Not one of them looked his way. But then something small. A voice. From the parking area just outside the glass wall, a young man in a neon vest waved and gave him a smile. The valet. Richard gave a subtle nod in return, a flicker of decency. Still, inside the showroom, nothing changed. He had become invisible. He stayed a few more minutes, walking between the cars like any curious shopper. He placed his hand on the hood of a cherry-red convertible, admired the paint, the precision, and wondered how many others had been turned away without a second glance. People who could have been lifelong customers. People who, like him today, were judged by appearance, not intention. And then quietly, Richard pulled out his phone. His thumb tapped a number already memorized. The voice on the other end picked up after one ring. "Brian," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to come down to the Wilshire location, now." And as he ended the call and slid his phone back into his pocket, Richard didn't look around. He didn't need to. The reckoning was already in motion. Richard didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes after he made the call, the sleek black company SUV pulled up to the front entrance. Out stepped Brian Turner, the regional director. Late 40s, sharp as ever in his tailored navy blue suit and polished Oxfords. As soon as the sales team spotted Brian through the showroom glass, the energy in the room shifted like a storm front rolling in. The receptionist quickly put down her phone and sat up straight. The salesmen who had been lounging in the corner suddenly spread out, pretending to be busy. One of them grabbed a brochure, another flipped open a tablet. The one who had mocked Richard just moments before. He was now pacing toward the front, like he was closing a $1 million deal. But it was too late. Brian walked in with a clipped stride, scanning the room, and then his eyes landed on Richard, and just like that the masks began to crack. The employees started whispering among themselves. Some glanced nervously at the door. Others stole side glances at Richard, slowly putting the pieces together. Was he? No. Couldn't be. But he was. Richard walked calmly toward the center counter, his sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. No announcement, no raised voice, just presence, and that was enough. He stood at the very same counter where he'd been brushed off not 20 minutes earlier, the same place where he was told with a smirk to go look at cheaper cars. Now with the staff gathered, some standing rigidly, others shifting uncomfortably, he finally spoke, and his voice was steady, low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "I came in today to test the quality of our cars," he said, "but instead I tested something far more important. Your character." A pause. You could hear someone swallow. "I wasn't offered help. I wasn't greeted. I was judged by what I wore, not who I was. If that's how we treat strangers, then we've already lost everything this brand stands for." One salesman stammered, "Sir, I didn't realize." But Richard held up his hand. "No excuses. You don't get to offer me coffee now that you know who I am. The question is, who were you when you thought I was nobody?" The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Brian stood to the side, arms crossed, saying nothing, but his eyes were locked on each employee. Richard turned to Brian and nodded slightly. "You know what to do." And just like that, the decision was made. The employees who had laughed, ignored, and dismissed him were let go, on the spot. No second chances. Some pleaded, others went quiet, knowing they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Richard didn't flinch, because today wasn't about punishment. It was about setting a standard. As the last dismissed employee walked out the door, Richard let out a slow breath. This wasn't the end. Something else was coming, and not everyone had failed the test. Just as the last employee's footsteps faded outside the showroom doors, a stillness settled over the room. The atmosphere, once full of fake charm and forced smiles, now felt raw, stripped to the truth. Richard remained quiet for a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. But then his tone shifted, because not everyone had failed the test. "There's one more thing," he said, turning to Brian. "Bring in the valet." Brian raised a brow but nodded, stepping outside for a moment. A minute later, the glass door swung open, and in walked Jake Matthews, a 24-year-old parking attendant, still wearing his orange reflective vest and slightly scuffed work boots. He looked confused, nervous even. Jake glanced around, clearly noticing the tension in the room. A few employees stared from the side, unsure why he had been summoned. Richard stepped forward with a calm smile, extending his hand. "You probably don't know who I am," he said. Jake hesitated for a moment, then shook his hand. "No, sir. But I hope I didn't do anything wrong." Richard chuckled softly, the first lightness in his voice all day. "You didn't. In fact, you're the only person here today who did something right." Jake blinked, unsure how to respond. Richard turned slightly, addressing the room. While others ignored me, laughed at me, or talked down to me, this young man, out in the heat, not even part of the sales team, greeted me kindly, looked me in the eye, and asked if I needed help. He turned back to Jake. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't have to say anything, but you chose to show respect to a total stranger. And that's exactly the kind of person I want representing my business." Jake's face turned red. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No," Richard replied. "You were doing more than that. You were doing the right thing, even when no one was watching." Brian stepped forward, handing Jake a white envelope. Jake took it, puzzled, then opened it slowly. Inside was a check for $5,000, along with a handwritten note from Richard himself. "Kindness is never wasted. Thank you for reminding me what this company is truly built on." Jake stared at it, speechless. "I want you to consider moving up," Richard added. "There's a place for people like you, people with heart and decency, inside these walls, not just outside them." The rest of the staff looked on, stunned, some with regret, others with respect. Jake simply nodded, still stunned, and quietly said, "Thank you, sir. Really." As Richard turned back toward the showroom floor, something inside him settled. The dealership may have looked perfect on the outside, but today proved that true value doesn't shine. It shows up in small, quiet moments of character. And Jake was the brightest thing he'd seen all day. As the sun dipped lower behind the skyline, casting golden streaks across the dealership's glass facade, Richard stood in the center of the showroom, silent for a moment, watching his reflection in the polished surface of a luxury sedan. What had started as a quiet visit in old jeans had turned into a defining moment for him, for his team, and for the values he built his entire business on. He turned to Jake, who was still holding the envelope like it was made of glass. "You keep being you," Richard said, giving the young man a final pat on the shoulder. "Don't let this place change you. Help you change it." With that, Jake nodded and headed back out to the valet station. This time, not just a parking attendant, but someone Richard saw as a future leader. Brian stayed behind, watching as Richard slowly made his way to the front doors. The room was quiet. The weight of everything that had just unfolded still hung heavy in the air. But Richard didn't look back. He pushed the doors open and stepped outside, greeted by the warm breeze of early evening. He stood there for a moment, breathed, and smiled. Because this hadn't been an act of revenge. It hadn't been about flexing authority or catching people off guard. It was about something far more important, a reminder. A reminder that respect isn't shown in scripted greetings or polished sales pitches. It's in the unspoken moments. The small gestures, the choice to treat someone with dignity even when you think there's nothing to gain. He thought back to the smirks, the assumptions, the salesman who didn't even wait for an answer before turning away. And then he thought of Jake. A simple smile, a warm greeting. A moment of humanity in a world too obsessed with appearances. That's what mattered most. As Richard walked toward his car parked down the block, he pulled out his phone and opened a note, something he did when an idea struck that he didn't want to forget. He typed, "Leadership isn't about the cars you sell. It's about the culture you create, the way your people treat those who don't look the part. That's your true brand." He stared at the words for a moment, then hit save. Tomorrow he would gather his senior team. There would be new training, yes, but more than that, a new message. A shift in the soul of the company. Because what happened today wasn't just a lesson for a few careless employees. It was a mirror held up to an entire business. And while some had failed the test, one young man had passed with flying colors. And that, Richard knew, was enough to start rebuilding, stronger than before. He got into his car and drove off into the fading light. He smiled once more, not because of what he had done, but because of what he had seen, and what he now knew had to come next. What would you have done if you were in Richard's shoes? Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you looked? Or maybe witnessed someone else being treated that way? Stories like this one remind us that respect, kindness, and character should never depend on appearance or status. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And more importantly, share your own experience. Have you ever surprised someone by being more than what they expected? Or maybe someone once showed you unexpected kindness when you needed it most? Your story might inspire someone else today. This community thrives on real voices, real lessons, and real moments that matter. So don't be shy. Let's talk about the little things that actually aren't so little. And remember, tomorrow's story is just as powerful. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and come back for another reminder that in a world full of flash, it's character that truly shines. We're listening, we care, and we can't wait to read what you have to say.